Hello and welcome to this episode of Battling with Business with me, Gareth Tennant.
And me, Chris Kitchener.
Cool. And so this week, Chris, unlike other podcasts, we don't have an emergency episode.
Oh, come on. All good podcasts have someone presses the emergency podcast.
Yeah. But what we have done is decided to record something that we'll push out earlier. So normally we stack these things up.
I was about to say, is it an emergency podcast when the thing you're talking about happened more than 2 weeks ago?
Well, yeah. So this is another one of those international events that has a huge amount to talk about in terms of the things that we like to talk about on this podcast. So leadership, organizational culture, strategy, decision-making, and you can tell from the title, this is clearly a podcast where we're going to focus on recent events in Venezuela and the ramifications of that more widely. But this is not going to be a political...
It's not a political rant or a morality conversation. And while we have our own perspectives on it, I'm sure they'll sort of slightly leak in as we go. Actually, I think to your point, there are various aspects of this from a leadership, management, culture perspective, which are absolutely fascinating and are in many ways often norm breaking, but also in many other ways, I still think, we were talking about just before we hit record on this, I think you see these parallels in modern business as well. Now, I know that might be a stretch to start with, saying the attack on a sovereign country and the removal of their leader, legitimate or illegitimate, whatever your perspectives are, has things that you can relate to business and other organizations. But actually, I don't think you have to scrape too far and get there. So
and that's the purpose of this podcast is to use military and business paradigms to explore what this means in terms of the commonalities with leadership, with strategy, with decision making, etc.
I think the reason why this also is particularly interesting is because the events in Venezuela and subsequent events are, I think it's fair to say, norm breaking, certainly extraordinarily unusual.
Yeah.
And so normally we talk about, well, this is how you should do things. We have a really interesting example of someone doing not the things that you would normally. So you can sort of test them and play around them, which is interesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Should we go back to the beginning, though? I think we need to remind people exactly what happened, because I am almost certain within 2 weeks we'll have forgotten this.
Yeah. Because
something else will have happened.
Yeah. Or it will have just been folded into the wider narrative of globally unfolding.
Yeah. So let's go back to what it is, or what's happened, more to the point. So over the past week, I think it's less than a week now, tensions between the United States and Venezuela clearly escalated to the point where there was a military confrontation. After months of pressure and, frankly, the deployment of, I think I heard today, a third of the US naval capabilities, so a huge fleet, it was sort of framed as an operation to target narcotics smuggling and alleged ties between Venezuelan leadership and drug networks.
Yeah.
But on January the 3rd, the US launched a large scale, I think we can call it massive scale, strike in Caracas and other Venezuelan cities involving elite special forces and air assets. How many air assets were used, Gareth?
So from reporting, they're talking about 150.
This is a massive air assault.
We'll talk in a moment what that might look like.
And just to remind people, a massive air assault to protect, in inverted commas, the law enforcement agents who are then going to arrest Maduro. But during this attack, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, Scylla, I bet it's Scylla Flores, were captured amongst what seems to be quite intense fighting. Again, there were significant casualties that were reported. I think a number of Cubans were killed, but I think the number we've heard recently is up to just over 100 casualties on the Venezuelan and Cuban side. Maduro and Flores were then flown to New York and they've been arraigned on federal charges, including narco-terrorism and drug trafficking. Both have pleaded not guilty. That's interesting. Caracas and allied governments have condemned condemned the assault as a violation of sovereignty and declared periods of mourning for military personnel killed in the operation. Very interesting about this. There are very few examples of nations, as it were, attacking another sovereign leader. Even with all-out war, it is very unusual to directly target the leader.
Certainly in modern history.
Very unusual.
Yeah.
Of course, interestingly, in the Caribbean, there is some examples of this, both covert action by the US and also overt action, the last overt action being the overthrow of Manuel Noriega in Haiti.
Noriega was Panama.
Panama, sorry. Panama. Don't worry, I'll edit that out so it doesn't sound like you got the wrong country.
The key difference with Noriega and Panama in 1983? Yeah. Was that the US never recognized Noriega as the head of state. So although, in terms of physically the action, very, very similar, legally, the US would argue that they were deposing somebody who was an illegitimate head of state.
Yes,
whereas Maduro recognized as the head of state, albeit
an illegitimate
record. Yeah,
I mean, we're sort of almost getting into it, which is there is a group of people saying here are some clear-cut reasons why this was not only acceptable, but in fact an excellent activity with a strong outcome. And there's a group of other people saying, well, hang on a minute, you're not allowed to do that. That is not appropriate. And then, so that's what's happened. I think most people will know this unless literally you've been living under a rock. Only a few days later, we have now, in inverted commas, semi-moved on to the idea that the United States want to either buy or somehow attach Greenland, gain control to the United States. So this shows already something that a number of years ago would have been the only thing that people had talked about for months and months and months and months.
Moving on.
We're already moving on. And
they're using it as well to build the narrative.
Absolutely. So an interesting strategy. Yeah. So anyway, that's the background.
Well, I think it's worth highlighting some of the wider context about Venezuela. So Venezuela potentially has the largest supply of untapped oil in the world. 50% of the world's gold.
Yeah.
A huge amount of rare earth metals and other commodities. So in terms of the potential for the country, it's massive. And I think this plays on both sides, because you can cynically say the Americans have gone in because they want to take control of the oil, the gold, the wealth extraction. And we can talk about that. What you can also say is that this is supposed to be an incredibly rich country. And actually, under the regime started by Hugo Chavez and then carried on by Maduro, huge runaway inflation, massive amounts of poverty, not a well-run country at all. So I think whilst we're not going to talk about we will have to talk about the politics, but whilst we're not going to get emotive about who was right and who was wrong, it is worth highlighting that a lot of people have been suffering.
Yeah.
And in my view, I think we haven't solved anything here. I think a lot of people are going to continue to suffer based on the instability that has been created. And the massive tragedy of all of this is that there was a potential for South America, and particularly states like Venezuela, to be incredibly prosperous and be a very positive part of the global system.
Well, let's just before, I know what we wanted to talk about to begin with from the military side is the assault.
Yeah.
Just because that is fascinating, unusual, we can talk about that. But before we get there, I think it's useful. We've made the claim that this isn't going to be a political episode. I think we'll stick to that. But we're talking about leadership.
We're going to have to dance around a lot of pinheads.
Well, but possibly. But I think I want to make the point that there's so much interesting going on from a leadership perspective, a management perspective, a people perspective. If you just think of some of the players here.
Yeah.
Donald Trump and the government of the United States, there's a group of people, each of which has to then deal with their constituents. There's a whole leadership and management exercise going on there. Maduro, let's not worry about him because he's in a jail in America, so he's not going to do much. But
The whole of the Maduro regime still exists.
Exactly.
So
the vice president has been sworn in as the temporary. So that person has to now deal with the Americans, has to deal with their own people, has to deal with their partners around the world. There are the military who are involved in the activity, who may or may not have agreed with that action. So this is highly unusual that something like this would be effectively classed as a law enforcement action. And I think this must be the first time in history that to arrest someone, the police have had 150 aircraft supporting them in activity. So there's a whole thing thereof. There will have been people flying helicopters, Delta Force. How do they feel about this? Then you go outside and you say, what about European leaders? How do they deal with this? Because there's the political ramifications depending on what they say in public, and then there is the ramifications of what their voters will say. So this is quite an unprecedented situation, unusual situation, and I think everyone is burning the candles at night to go, what do we do? How do we deal with this? So this isn't just, we're a leadership and management and sort of cultural podcast. How do we wedge this in? No, I think this is a really good example. And while I'd like to think most organizations don't invade sovereign countries and arrest their leaders or attack competing companies and take their leader hostage, there's a lot of parallels here in terms of some of the things we might tackle later on.
Yeah, and I think directly from a business point of view as well, I'm in about a month's time, just over a month, I've been asked to give a talk at a business conference, and the title is Signals in the Noise, Understanding Geopolitical Risk in a Fragmented World. And I'm rewriting my talk. I started to write some notes out about this when I was asked to do it just before Christmas. I'm having to rewrite it.
I was about to say, did you throw it all away? I mean, this is decision-making in uncertainty.
I think if you are a large organisation, in fact, even if you're a medium organisation, if you do more than just locally sell local produce to local people, if you have any kind of international trade, any kind of reliance on supply chains, reliance on the insurance market, reliance on raw material commodities, then this is going to impact how your business operates and how you are going to need to make decisions going forward. So I think there's all of that. But before we do that, in my role as the military half of Battling with Business, I'd like to just explore the actual raid itself and some of the decision-making and implications that speculatively I think would have had to have gone into that. So we've already sort of highlighted the fact that this is a 150 aircraft. And the reason that there will be 150 aircraft is because this is a classic raid. And a raid is an assault where the objective is not to seize ground, but it's to have an effect and then get out. So you go in, you do something, and you get out. So if you think for the Second World War classic raid, it was go in, smash up a radar station, get out, or go in, free prisoners of war and get out, or something like that. In this case, it's go in, find and arrest the target, bundle him onto a helicopter and get out.
It's kind of a Bin Laden.
Very, very similar. And the process for planning this operation would have been very, very similar. A special forces operation, so lots of resources at their disposal, lots of access to intelligence that conventional forces potentially wouldn't have access to. But the target, Maduro, head of state, is protected also, given the pressure that has been put on Maduro, his security would have been ramped up as well, but is protected by the military capabilities of the nation.
He was captured on a military base.
Yeah, a fort, as it was described.
With strengthened doors and a secure room, which he failed to get to.
But I think everybody can kind of imagine armed guards and all that sort of stuff. But you've also got things like radar systems, air defense systems, the whole
communications
and intelligence infrastructure and architectures of a nation to protect the president and other high value capabilities and assets. So from the American point of view, they would have needed to secure the operating airspace. And there are various methods for doing that, but effectively...
Bombing them is usually quite effective.
Well, I was going to say, effectively, you've got suppression and denial. And suppression is where you get the radar operators to turn their radars off because of the threat of being denied, or denial, where you destroy those capabilities by bombing them, pretty much. And it looks like it was a combination of the two. So some quite technical electromagnetic activity, jamming of frequencies and taking control of radar systems and all of that kind of good stuff. A little bit of brute force jamming.
My understanding is there were cyber attacks as well. So this is all...
There almost certainly would have been.
What's interesting is this is a very rare case where Donald Trump has revealed many things that normally would never be revealed. So he congratulated Cyber Command.
Yeah.
Apparently, it was stated by various sources that at one point the US military controlled all of the Venezuelan military and government communications. No more was said about that. There was a cyber attack. The lights in Caracas were put out.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. Sorry, I'm doing it because I'm as much of a nerd.
So what needs to happen, and if you understand, we're already talking about lots of different agencies and organisations. Aircraft flying, they need to be refueled. So some of these aircraft would have been refueling aircraft. Some of these aircraft would have been there to provide support if things go wrong. So we've talked about consequence planning. If you think about Black Hawk Down, that operation, very similar on a much smaller scale, a raid to go and neutralise a high-value target. It went wrong because one of the helicopters was shot down. You have to have a con plan, and it's what we call a JPR event, a Joint Personnel Recovery event. So if a Special Forces team or a helicopter gets shot down, there's a pilot or a team trapped and they need to be rescued. So there's a whole lot of stuff that you have flying ready to be responsive. You've then got to provide protection to all of those systems and all those capabilities. You've got to be able to refuel them for the duration of the operation. Plus, you've got Cyber Command, who are in bunkers, presumably in the continental US, not flying around, so in a different location. Then you've got people that you're going to deploy onto the ground with helicopters. Helicopters fly at very different speeds to fast jets. And so suddenly this becomes a huge operation that requires synchronization of lots and lots of different types of capabilities.
Where do you, I think for most people are sort of now broadly aware of what happened in Abbottabad with bin Laden, where this was effectively something very similar, but perhaps at a slightly smaller scale. What you've described is enormous complexity. In fact, my understanding is the CIA put boots on the ground in August of last year. That's what they're starting to suggest.
Yeah.
The plan was asked for in September, and it took them between September and the end of the year to prepare the plan. So not just prepare the plan you just talked about, but also apparently somewhere in the desert they built a mock-up of the building they were going to assault and practice. All the things we've talked about in terms of practice. But going back to this idea of you've got thousands of moving pieces, where do you start to organize 1,000 moving pieces? Because this, there's almost an element of like, what's the starting point?
Yeah.
And otherwise you poke the balloon and the bit comes out. Well, we need the helicopters to be there. Well, how do we get the helicopters there? Well, we need these, but no, we can't. Where do you start these things?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there's a thing called the operational planning process, which is a NATO standard way of planning operations. And there are variations of it. We talked through the combat estimates in an episode a few months ago. Effectively, you start with what do you know and what don't you know and what do you need to know. And that's where the CIA are doing their thing. That's human intelligence. So they're building relationships with people, trying to get information by persuading or convincing people within the regime or with access to give information.
Apparently they had, the implication is they had an agent in Maduro's entourage to tell them where he was going because he moved around.
You would imagine so. And of course, so there's this combination of the things you know. So you know what your capabilities are. You know what the burn rate of fuel is for an F-22 Raptor. You know how high it needs to fly, all those kind of things. So the stuff you can plan into intricate detail, and there's the stuff you don't know. and the stuff that you're going to need to know. And you break those things out. So the things that you need to know become your prioritized intelligence requirements. And through a whole load of clever, some of it very technical, signals intelligence, some of it literally paying people, bribing them, blackmailing them, whatever, to get that human intelligence. Some of it open source scraping of the internet and social media and all those kind of good things. As an interesting point, as counter to this operation, it was obvious it was going to happen because, once again, pizza orders outside the Pentagon and outside the White House spiked about an hour before the operation. So again, if you're monitoring pizza delivery in the downtown Washington area, you can get a sense of when top secret operations are going to happen. But they will have been
Greenland will be placing an entrance.
Yeah. They would have been doing something similar, monitoring trends on open source information, social media, etc. And effectively, you get to a point where you have enough information about the target, about the things that you need to affect the air defense systems, what the defenses look like, how many people are going to be on the ground, to be able to then make risk decisions. And this would have come down to somebody at almost the very top, if not the very top, so possibly Donald Trump, possibly Pete Hegseth, but somebody giving what we call the green light, the go, no go, sir, we think we've got all the intelligence, we think we're set, we're ready to go, do we have approval? And typically what will happen is you'll get, are we legally okay to do this? Do we have all the capabilities to be able to do this? Do we have all the intelligence questions answered? What is the risk? And a whole load of advisors will talk through all of these things. And ultimately, once all of those criteria are met, they say, yeah, let's go. And then the system goes into effect.
And just to pick up on that, because I was thinking about it when it happened, everyone I've met who kind of understands these things suggests this was an incredibly well-executed mission, unless there's something we don't know about, incredibly well-executed. But actually, this could have gone horribly wrong.
Oh, yeah.
And you only have
Very
to go back
risk
in history and you can see all sorts of, in inverted commas, equivalent military operations. One example was the attempt to recover the American hostages in the Iranian, that the Iranians captured. And that went horribly wrong. And in the end, they abandoned aircraft. It would only have taken a couple of helicopters to have been shot down. And that isn't inconceivable given the complexity of the plan you've talked about, the fact that it was a military base. And it would have gone terribly, terribly wrong. And in terms of decision making, very interestingly, the US government, I don't know, and I don't know we'll ever know, might either have said, we think this is such a watertight attack plan that we think that's unlikely to happen, or they might have said, we think even if that does happen, that we will simply just attack, we will use brute force, or they didn't really care. Well, do you know what I mean? And I don't know, but there's some really interesting decision making
from a military perspective, and I have worked with Americans and US military, and I've worked within US military operations. And I would say they're very, very similar to the way that the rest of NATO does it. So this would have been very well rehearsed. As you say, they would have built up mock-ups of the buildings. They would have practiced. The pilots would have flown similar routes, either virtually or really, out on training areas in Nevada or somewhere. This would have been practiced to the nth degree, but also there would have been a lot of red teaming it.
Yeah.
So there would have been a lot of, well, what happens if a helicopter gets shot down? What happens if we lose an aircraft? What happens if the agent that we're getting this intelligence from is a double agent? And so
I agree from a military perspective, and I think there are sufficient known knowns in the military world where I can believe that. But this is such a large, complex, and geopolitically...
Yes. So I think the bit where...
It changed it. So it's not about whether the military is going to be successful.
Yeah.
That's quite clear. But as I say...
Well, it's not clear, but what is very clear is...
better understood and better planned for.
It's understood what the risk versus the reward is. So if you've seen the film Zero Dark 30, which is the film about the raid into Abbottabad to get Osama bin Laden, They talk to the CIA analyst and they say, what do you think, what is the chance that Osama bin Laden is in this compound? And there's a whole debate about what the percentage is. And the decision that the president had to make was based on that percentage of chance versus the risk of the operation and the risk of something going wrong. And that's where all these advisors come in. I think in this case, it's particularly interesting because something like a helicopter going down, well, if this happens, we've got a contingency plan, we've got a JPR team, we'd fly these things, and we'd control this airspace, we'd seal off the area and get them out. Actually, on the Abbottabad raid, they did lose a helicopter. And they lost it, actually, on the objective. They denied it, and they got the guys out.
Denied it by blowing it up rather than saying that didn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
military language.
Yeah. So I think those kind of things are relatively well rehearsed, relatively well understood. I think what's perhaps slightly more difficult in this case is the why. Why are we doing this? So I talked about, all those green lights that you need to get for the go ahead from the command. Normally, the legal part of that is a huge part of the targeting process. So is this legal? And what you're looking for is this legal under international law? Is this supportive of our overall mission? So is it worth doing? Even if it is legal, does it help us further our strategic aims? And do we have the capabilities to do this? And in this case, I think those first two questions are really, really difficult to answer. And that's the bit where I think maybe they didn't care.
Well, yes, I don't know. I think you're right. And by the way, we're dancing on this pin as we've discussed. I actually don't think the statement saying the US government right now is not as worried about the legal implications as perhaps previous people. But here's the thing that I think is really interesting. Do I think Pete Hegseth, Donald Trump have taken detailed, thoughtful legal advice on this? Maybe, maybe not. But actually, there was a huge number of people involved in this mission. And as you say, there are many people who are saying, this is illegal.
Yeah.
This was a sovereign country. There are laws that say you cannot do this. It was abduction. You're not allowed to take people to your country for a crime when they're not in your country. All these kinds of things. Interestingly, I'm a Chinook pilot flying from Iwo Jima with Delta Force in the back. Is this an illegal order or is this not a legal order? Now, by the way, this is not about me trying to say whether I think it is or isn't, but I think that's a really tricky thing because if I'm a captain flying a Chinook, I think I'm likely to say there's no way they could have this many people involved. What I'm going to assume it's not illegal. Do you know what I mean? You get to this point where actually I don't want to be those soldiers because if you said to me, Chris, I want you to bomb that school over there and kill those children because there's probably a terrorist there, okay, I'm all good. That is an illegal order. I'm not doing it. If you say I want you to assault this country and take these FBI guys because we're going to arrest Nicolas Maduro, I think that's a really difficult thing. And let's take this back to a business.
Yeah.
The boss says, I want you to go away and I want you to ask that customer how much our competitors are charging because what we're going to do is we're going to undercut them. Is that illegal? My boss is asking me. It can't be. If he's asking me, he'd never do something like that. So I think
there's a really interesting sort of point here, which we talked about when we looked at why good people do bad things. So we looked at the Holocaust and we looked at how not everybody in Germany who was a fighting age male working in the German army or for the German state was a diehard Nazi war criminal. And yet the whole nation blindly kind of walked into it. And we did a whole sort of exploration of that. I think militaries are designed culturally to be relatively obedient.
Yes.
To follow orders, to act in the best interest of the mission, of the team, of the command. And interestingly, the mission, the team, and the command, that's very similar to Adair's Balls, team, task, individual. The individual being the commander, the mission being the task, the team being the team. So, as a Chinook pilot, you're not being asked to make a decision whether it's legal to go and arrest a head of state of a foreign country. As a Chinook pilot, you're being asked to fly a low flight profile, below air defense radars, to land a Delta Force team safely. That's your mission.
I agree.
And at which point, you almost can absolve yourself of the wider context. And it becomes really interesting because that's where you can start to say, well, was the camp guard whose job was just to, count train carriages in and out, were they complicit in the Holocaust? Well, of course they were. Or were they just part of a much wider thing and they'd absolved themselves?
We've got a similar one here, which is over 100 people died.
Yeah.
This was ostensibly a police action. In other words, someone's being sent arrested. Is that justified? Now, again, I think we can divert from this. In fact, we should take a break in a second. This is not about, do we think morally this is justified or not justified, is illegal or not illegal.
Where it's ambiguous.
But it's ambiguous, and I think it's
interesting.
The thing for me is, I think it's actually really hard.
Yeah.
I could imagine there were soldiers saying, this is an illegal order because I'm going to kill. A Delta Force person could say, I expect I'm going to have to kill plenty of soldiers who we are not at war with. Or likewise say, no, as you say, my mission is to go do this. So very, very difficult.
And the counter to this, because I realise I've sort of left this with comparing a Delta Force, a very exceptionally executed Delta Force raid to the Holocaust, and I want to dial back from that because I want to also say what you can't have in military organisations is every soldier
making every
saying,
decision.
I need to know what the general at the very top is signing off on.
Well,
because if you're the driver who delivers the fuel to refuel the aircraft, we don't. Part of the reason this massive operation works is because we've got mission command, we've delegated authority, we've given intent. So not everybody needs to know all the detail of everything.
I think it's a really fascinating case of frog boiling because
it is.
I think the point is it could have gone all wrong.
Yeah.
And right now there could be 40,000 US Marines in Venezuela and an open fighting, or as we luckily had this. But I think the point I wanted to make there was, in that case, it is the leadership that has to be responsible for this. We can't. Yeah. I'm not a fan of. We should arrest and prosecute the guy driving the fuel truck on Iwo Jima, the assault ship.
Yeah.
But I am saying, but what we do have to do, and this is true in business organizations, is someone has to be responsible.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, if this is illegal, great, well done.
Yeah.
And if it is illegal, how are we going to hold people accountable? But this is more about a recognition.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think this is difficult because it was actually clearly a grey area. If you're the poor guy who is driving the fuel truck and you're saying, this fuel carried the Delta Force that killed 80 people tonight, how do you deal with that?
So I think what's really interesting is, I think you're right. I think this is about the leadership. One of the things that we talk about a lot in terms of good organisations, good leadership, is this idea of mutual trust. I trust that you're not going to question everything I do because you respect my authority and you respect my rank and my experience to make the right decisions on your behalf. And you trust that I'm going to be working to make sure that what I ask you to do is for the right reasons, is legal, is not putting you in jeopardy, that isn't, a worthwhile risk to work, that's been balanced. And I think this is a really interesting case. So when we come back after the break, I'd like to look at this idea of the model of leadership that we constantly refer to, which is Adair's model, team, task, individual. And I'd like to look at what it means when we're in such new territory, when the ambiguity is so large that you're having to really trust the decisions that are being made by other people, and actually what consequences of these actions, the consequences of these decisions are potentially making future decisions even harder.
I think that's fascinating. I'm sure there will be someone who participated in the raid who is thinking, should I be in this organisation? Can I now trust my leadership?
Yeah.
Is this now the new norm? Very, very difficult. Let's take a quick break. Let's come back and keep talking about I'm not sure we can call it Letters from Venezuela. That's sort of an NPR, nice, cutesy story about Venezuela. Let's come back and talk about some of these really, really thorny challenges that I think we can all learn from. Welcome back. So before the break, we spent quite a lot of time talking about the military operation.
Yeah.
We talked about a little bit about some of the challenges of people participating in that. You want to talk a bit more about Adair's model here?
I think we've kind of touched on this before, but what is particularly interesting about this case is that these are decisions that are getting made within what we often refer to as the international order. So this is a system of understanding, legal frameworks, legal agreements, which seem to have been broken or stretched or interpreted in new ways. And the thing that's slightly different in this context to if you're a military tactical commander or if you're a business leader is that typically the framework within which you operate is pretty rigid. So when people say these are the laws of the land that you must comply with as a business leader, or these are the laws of armed conflict and the military law of your nation state that you must comply with as a military leader, those are black and white, and there are enforcement mechanisms. In this context, there aren't any enforcement mechanisms, which I think changes the leadership dynamic. And there are lots of examples in history of where people have pushed into these new areas and effectively changed the rules of the game. And with that in mind, when we think about the Adair's model, the team, the task, the individual, if we look at Donald Trump, the ultimate decision maker of the US in this case, he is the individual. He has a level of vested responsibility, authority, and accountability as the commander-in-chief of the US military, as the leader of the political state of the United States, all of the federal agencies. He has a lot of executive power. We can debate whether he overstretched that or not. I don't think that's necessarily relevant. But he is making these decisions in order to support the task of making sure that the primary goal of a head of state is the security of the nation state. That is the first priority of all political leaders. Secondly, the prosperity, and these things go hand in hand, and the future development and improvement of that nation state. The organisation, the team, is, in this case, all of those federal agencies and organisations that supported this effort. And if you take this as an isolated case, it's relatively easy to craft a narrative where the individual has made decisions in support of the task and used the resources of the team to achieve that. And so it's relatively easy to craft a narrative and say, this was good leadership. It's also just as easy to take the context of this and say, you've eroded the international order, and therefore what you think of as developing the security of the nation state of the US is actually now more insecure because the world within which we operate is more insecure. You could take a more cynical view and say he doesn't really care about the task, and this is more about his legacy, or really being, cynical about it, this is about personal power, personal enrichment, in which case the whole system of leadership breaks down.
What's interesting to me about this is, whether you agree or disagree with this, something which I'm reminded of, and actually if you look back with a certain lens through history, is you'd said there are norms, there are laws.
Yeah.
And I think we almost assumed they would never be broken. We built them into our heuristics and our decision making, when actually the reality is, in history, at significant points in time, people have said, yeah, I don't agree with that. That's absolute nonsense. We're not going to do that. So I think this is an absolutely fascinating case where someone has said, I'm going to take the rules and I'm going to break those rules. And again, this is not, in this case, a decision whether it's good or bad, but I think we have to remind ourselves that we shouldn't always assume that the status quo will carry on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really important point. I think there's several. I'm going to give you two examples where the good Western nations have done exactly that. So at the end of the Second World War, we tried, the German military commanders and political commanders and leaders, and there's a great film, just come out with Russell Crowe
playing Goering.
A brilliant film about Nuremberg. Well, those rules didn't exist.
Yeah.
They didn't exist at the time when the crimes committed by the Germans took place. But there was such an international revulsion to what the Germans did in the Holocaust and in the course of the war that the international norms were changed in order to ensure, firstly, that punishment was given, but also to ensure that these things don't happen again. Now, there's a really interesting debate about why we didn't do that to Russia, who had arguably done similarly quite horrible mass killings on a similar scale. We're not here to have that debate, but we changed the law, we changed the international system to our benefit and arguably for the benefit of the world.
And so the point there is, it's all very well for us to be hand-wringy about how this is breaking international norms, but history is littered with governments, friendly and otherwise, breaking those norms and us conveniently saying they're okay.
Yeah.
Maybe the bigger thing here is, rather than it being a moral judgment, although there has to be some morality in there, we're dancing on the head of this pendulum, let's say.
Yeah.
But I think this is just, I actually thought of it in a much more positive way, which is, how do you think about this not so much as this sort of earth-shattering geopolitical thing, which is Donald Trump said, here are the rules, I choose to invent a different set of rules. I had a brilliant example, by the way. This is, I met up with a friend I haven't seen for quite a while, and he relayed a story of drones.
Yeah.
And the problem was, this particular drone, when it got close to the enemy, was emitting too much radar or too much electronic information.
Yeah.
And so they needed to work out how to decrease the amount of electronic information, how much it emitted. Yeah. And so therefore they were worrying about, how do they mask it? How do they hide it? And my friend said, why don't you just get 10 more and turn the emitters up to maximum? So you don't try to hide where you are. You just make it impossible for them to work out where you are because there's so much noise. Yeah. To me, that's a really interesting parallel, which is, what if you change the rules? Donald Trump has just said, I choose to change the rules.
Yeah.
We can have a discussion about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, right or wrong. But in a sense, I think it's a really interesting business technique to say, if you, for example, were the leader of a country who wanted access to the remaining 70% of the world's oil fields, you might decide, I'm going to ignore international law because I have the largest military on the planet, and therefore, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, normally, and when I said about military leaders or business leaders, you normally have a system of governance where laws can be enforced. In the international system, what normally happens is we follow these laws because they're in everybody's interest.
Yes.
And there are consequences of not following them. There is a really good example of where, again, the Western world took it upon itself to break the law, interpret the law in a new way, ignore the law, however you want to discuss and debate it. And that's Kosovo in 1999. Now, there's a really clear moral justification for why NATO bombed Belgrade, because Serbia was persecuting the Kosovo. There's a really, really strong case to be made. The consequences, though, of NATO effectively changing its mandate for what it is and stretching, breaking, ignoring international law gave other organisations in this anarchic state system the green light to do the same. And Russia saw Kosovo and was repulsed by it. And they suddenly decided that, it led to a continuation of a distrust between Russia and the West, and arguably gave them the justification for what they then did in Georgia, what they did in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, what they did in Transnistria, in Moldova, what they did in Syria,
Isn't it interesting?
and ultimately what they tried to do in Ukraine.
Well, I mean, you've got all sorts of sort of really interesting things, which is the validity, the correctness, the morality of what you do is in the eye of the beholder.
Yeah,
but we would say all of those things that the Russians did were abhorrent, and the Russians would say what you did was abhorrent.
Yeah.
No, but we were in the right. We were in the right.
And that's where taking a moral stance, and it is arguably an admirable thing to do, but we need an ethical framework that we agree to. Well, and this is the difference between morality and ethics.
The other thing as well, which strikes me, is consistency.
Yeah.
And this is, I don't know anyone, I haven't heard anyone say this word consistency, but the case is right now, I think it will be very difficult for the US government to look someone in the eye and say, you shouldn't do that because it's against the rules, whatever the rules are. It is really difficult, but really important for businesses and governments to be consistent, because that's where the problems start. Right now, there is a discussion about whether America will take action, in inverted commas, against Greenland.
Yeah.
Some are saying, well, they would never invade Greenland, and people will be saying, how is that any different to what you did in Venezuela? So consistency matters so much, and I personally, I think this is going to be something which, much like Kosovo, will actually be remembered for many, many, many years.
Yeah.
And even if people say, you know what, we understand, and maybe it's even a different government, people remember and say, but this was something that could never, ever happen. And then you went and did it.
Yeah.
You've now proved to us whatever we think can never happen, you might actually do one day.
So I think there's a business example where we can get away from the sort of moral quagmire. But it's a very relevant and current situation, which is weight loss drugs. So a company called Novo Nordisk created an ability to suppress the appetite and created a drug that you inject that became incredibly popular. Now, effectively, the analogy to this is they've changed the rules. So the weight loss industry, or the pharmaceutical industry, was changed overnight. The rules were changed. There's no moral quandary. Well, there probably is, but we're not going to get into it. Very different moral quandary.
But it's interesting. It turns out there is morality in any decision.
There absolutely is. But my point is here, they changed the rules. They did something that broke international norms, albeit arguably in a very positive way and in a perfectly legal way. They then didn't manage to scale quickly enough to capitalise on that. And a company called Eli Lilly, which is a big American pharmaceutical company, created a very similar drug using very similar innovation and science, and then captured the market. And then a whole load of copycat organisations. And Novo Nordisk is now financially struggling because they've changed the rules of the game and not played consistently.
Unintended consequences.
And that's my point. Unintended consequences.
We should come back to strategy in a second, but I was thinking about this, and before we came on, I scribbled down some questions. we're talking about your case of norm breaking or changing.
Yeah.
This clearly is the attack on a sovereign state and the removal of the head of state. Whether you're a government or a business, how do you step back from a norm breaking change? Or perhaps a better question is, can you step back? So now, if Russia sent helicopters into Kyiv, captured Zelensky and took him back to Moscow and put him on trial, I don't know that there's a lot people can say about. I mean, they can, but the United States certainly can't say this is a bad thing. In fact, potentially they'd even say it was a totally reasonable thing. How do you
change the game?
Yeah, how do you step back from the change the game?
Yeah.
Let's go back to a business. A business says,
"Well, I think AI.
we never pay off cyber terrorists.
Yeah.
Oh my God! If we don't pay the cyber terrorist off, our business will be closed.
Yeah.
We break the rule. We never pay off clients, and we pay off a client.
Yeah.
We never accept bribes, and we accept a bribe or give a bribe. How can you step back from these things? How does the United States?
Well, it's incredibly difficult, and I think once you do this, it requires a consensus. And there are some things where, over time, you can repair damage and you can build trust and you can rebuild consensus. And some things, you've crossed a Rubicon, and it's now
hard.
Pandora's box is open. I'm using lots of different analogies here, but the new way of doing things is now there. So AI is one of those things. There are lots of people who are advocating for AI because it's going to solve climate change and it's going to mean that we can all not work and paint pictures and become incredibly wealthy.
Don't need to paint pictures. The AI can do it for us.
And then there's lots and lots of people saying this is incredibly dangerous, and agentic AI might have some benefits. But
I have to say, I don't know whether you heard this quote, and I can't verify it's true. Maybe I'll verify it before we publish this, which is, I think it was Sam Altman was asked, could AI end the world?
Yeah.
And he answered, yes, I think that's quite possible. But in the meantime, we will be able to build some really large and important businesses.
Yeah.
And I just thought, what an amazing statement. If that's true, that is truly amazing statement where he said, yes, we could all die because of this.
Yeah.
But on the bright side, we can make a lot of money along the way.
So I think we're in this kind of situation where when the rules change, you need to either adapt your system to the new game, or you need to build consensus, and it's really difficult. And without wanting to get too philosophical, or too sort of academic, you're into a game of game theory.
Well, but
because you are now having to talk to competitors about readjusting the system.
Promise we won't do it again.
I promise we won't do it.
But there are ways of doing that.
In our mutual interest.
There are ways of doing that. In a business's case, you fire people and you say the people who were responsible for this have gone.
And that builds trust.
Yeah. So I think there's some practical things. Here's a different question, and we'll flip around with this because I think this is such a far-reaching and surprising thing. Strategy.
Yeah.
We have talked a lot about strategy. Now, if you'd have said to me 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump is pursuing a strategy of regime change, and in order to do that, a strategy of regime change, access to oil, power, potentially slowing down drug trafficking to America. I'm not sure that's necessarily true, but all those things. If you said to me, in order to achieve that strategy, he would send 150 aircraft, Delta Force, and the largest fleet we've seen in recent history to do that, I would say he's not going to do that because that's a terrible strategy. I know for a fact there are many people, even if they don't believe it, saying it. Well, you might think that, but it was successful. Notionally, Venezuela are going to give America access to oil.
So
Nicolas Maduro's not there.
Yeah.
Was this a good strategic move if you assume it achieved the outcome? In fact, let's be clear. It achieved what has at least been stated to us. The outcome was to arrest and remove Maduro.
So I'm going to do my really annoying thing here and
which one?
Split hairs around strategy and tactics. And I would say the military strategy of suppression of air defences to get Delta Force
was
in,
successful.
Was successful. Blah, 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 blah. Lots of tactical bits to make that whole system work. We kind of talked about that. That whole raid was a tactical play on the geopolitical stage, and therefore it's really, really difficult to say, was that strategically successful? Because it's one of many, many things that Donald Trump is doing. What I would say, though, is in competitive strategic situations, I was going to say games, but this is not a game, this is geopolitics. But in competitive strategic situations, a very strong tactic is ambiguity and surprise. And Donald Trump is a master of what I would call open ambiguity. So most ambiguity is created by hiding information. I'm going to not tell you what I'm doing, and then I'm going to suddenly do something, and that's going to be surprising. And Donald Trump does a bit of that, but largely what he does is he just throws so much stuff out there. He says, yeah, we're going to keep the oil. Oh, so it's all about oil. But it's also about smashing boats because it's about drugs. Oh, it's about drugs. And there's so many different narratives that the ambiguity gets hidden in the noise. The other thing that I would say is really interesting about Donald Trump, and we did a whole influencers episode on this, is this kind of almost paradoxical, he is erratic and unpredictable. At the same time, he constantly tells you what he's trying to do.
It's amazing.
It's amazing.
It's amazing.
If you read the Project 2025 strategy, and it is a strategy document, it's a doctrine, it's a strategy document, it talks about their goals and how they're going to achieve them.
Pretty much did it.
They are a really good way through in the first year of this administration doing it. Now, by reading that strategy, could I have predicted that they were going to do a special forces raid into Caracas and take Maduro? No. Am I surprised they've done that? No. So what I would say is this a normal strategy for a US president? Absolutely not. Is it breaking norms? Yes. Is it working so far?
Well, and just to go back to because thank you for being very polite about picking me up on the difference between strategy and tactics.
It's not polite. It's irritating. I do it all.
No. But it's actually it's actually really useful because I think it forces you to think about things in different ways. And I'm gonna keep an eye out. I'm gonna give you a side eye to see whether you agree with me on this. I think he has a clear strategy of what you have just discussed, which is I will flood whatever my goal is. My strategy to achieve it is to force you to be focused on the three things back that I did. So I think that is a strategy, and we can talk about whether that's successful. I think that is, for now, highly successful. The fact that we're talking about whether he's going to invade Greenland 2 days after the largest raid.
But it's successful for Trump, and it's successful for the Trump administration.
Yeah, I agree.
It's not successful for the American people.
We'll
come back to that.
We'll come back to that. From a tactics perspective, I think that's really interesting. And maybe this is, whether it's strategy or tactics. Here's my perspective on this. Right now, there are lots of people clapping and saying, Donald Trump is a genius because he does all of these things and no one stops him and they can't keep up. I don't know that we know whether this strategy is successful or not. I think today it seems reasonably successful, but actually it could lead to some dramatic outcomes at some point.
I think it will.
At some point, do the Republicans say, we're going to impeach you, and this time we're going to vote for that? And then all of a sudden, it's I don't know whether that's a likely outcome, but the point I'm trying to make is, actually, the more he breaks norms, the more he does this, there's a higher likelihood of a more dramatic outcome.
Yeah.
And so, number one, it's too early to say whether his strategy is successful. The near-term tactics seem to be successful, probably.
Well,
but the longer term, what is his? I mean, maybe this is we're getting a little bit political now. Does he have a long-term strategy, or is it literally a transactional? My strategy was to get Maduro.
I think his strategy hasn't changed from when he was a real estate mogul in New York in the 70s. His strategy is to be bolshy, is to be narcissistic, be selfish,
double down,
fight everything, deny wrongdoing, slander your enemies. This is the Donald Trump playbook. Strategically, it has been incredibly successful because he's gone from relatively wealthy real estate to
vastly wealthy, head of the most powerful military in the world,
country in the world, with an almost zealotist cult following. Is that strategically good as President of the United States? Absolutely not. Is this good for the American people? No. They're going to pay more for things. They are more isolationist. That increases risk. National security is now more fragile for the whole world than it has ever been. And a large part of that, in my opinion, is because of this administration. It's also because of Russia. It's also because of AI. It's also because of climate change and a whole load of other things. But he has made the world a more unsafe place where he had the opportunity to make it safer, and he had the opportunity to make it safer for Americans. Whether in a year's time we've got American forces fighting a counterinsurgency campaign in Venezuela, in which case that tactic was also strategically a failure, which could lead to a political strategic failure because he ran on a ticket of, I'm not like all the other people who get you involved in these forever wars in the Middle East. So there's a whole lot of nuance there.
Maybe the takeaway for us is when we talk about strategy and tactics, you have to be very clear about the outcome that you're trying to lead to.
Yeah.
And I think when we talk about the United States strategy today, we're not very good at being clear what their strategy is, what we think it is. And likewise, strategy and tactics, frankly, depend based on who you are. To your point, I would imagine Donald Trump is very pleased with this strategy at the moment. It's all going swimmingly. If you talk to a number of people who vote for him, they may or may not be as pleased about that strategy. So it's variable, but it's difficult.
Can I just make a very quick point on that whole diatribe that we've just gone through, which is, it is difficult, and it's really difficult for us to judge. And maybe in a year's time we can have a sort of come back to this and a chat about it. But what I would say is, on the general trends, the system you're operating in, the less erratic that system is, and the more
successful,
coherent that is, the easier it is to have a coherent strategy. So there are sometimes times where breaking norms can give you a massive advantage. But more often than not, it is not worth sacrificing the long-term stability.
Well, I think let's extend that point. We spend hour upon hour talking about good leadership, good management, good culture, all these ingredients that go well. Pretty much all of these activities are counter to those. And I mean this at a really, really sort of broad level as well. It is better to work with others than to be isolationist and say, I don't need you. That is a human truth. It is better to be genuine and honest with people.
And I think that that extends beyond the geopolitical isolation.
Yes, I think it goes from individual team members, voters, through to geopolitical.
Absolutely. And Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump had their calling in all of the generals and admirals from across the Department of War, as it is now. One of the things they absolutely did there was to isolate their position from the culture of the Department of Defense. Those people in the audience, I couldn't even put a number on what their collective experience would be in years, but these are the senior leaders, both non-commissioned and commissioned, of the Department of Defense, and they effectively isolated themselves from them by telling them that all of their policies and all of their cultural norms were wrong. And whilst in the short term that might have generated a little bit of populism within some of the ranks of the Department of Defense, now Department of War, in the long term, that's just created a much more difficult culture.
Well, I wonder whether this is another thing we haven't talked about, which is the difference between power and authority.
It's interesting.
What you have just described, and I completely agree, is I would argue to some degree these things have been done through the use of absolute power.
Yeah.
I am incontrovertibly in charge. Anyone who dares to disagree with me will be punished. I think there's a lot of that. That's different from authority, which says, I am leading you because I have authority, and that authority comes from how I behave, how I work with you. One is I don't care whether you agree with me or not. We're doing this because I choose to do this. Another one says, we're doing this. I am leading you. And I think that's what we're seeing at the moment. We're seeing the use of raw power. Donald Trump, as a real estate person, the best way he had to annoy someone is sue them. And he did a lot of that. As the president of the United States, he has $1 trillion military, and he can say, Joint Chiefs of Staff, I want you to attack that city. I want that man in a jail cell. And very interesting, we haven't talked about this. How much does this cost everyone?
Yeah.
Because I suspect this is an enormous amount of money, but that's that. Last question from me, because I think we can go on all night on this one, but I think we've got a really good example, and I was going to use a British leader for this, but it doesn't matter. It's a European leader. And this is this idea of authority without leverage. Right now, everyone is asking all the European leaders, what do you think about this? And quite pragmatically, I think most of them are being very cautious in their response. Cautious in the sense of, even if they disagree, they are very clear to say Maduro is a bad person. You know, we're concerned about that. They're very careful in this, all the way through to, you know, I can't speak on behalf of the US government. Of course, lots of people jump on that and say, you're a terrible leader. I think this is a terrible, terrible thing. You should stand up to America.
It's so difficult.
I think from a moral perspective, from a global leadership perspective, I have every sympathy with the people saying, and we'll say Starmer should stand up and say that. However, Mr. Starmer has to balance the fact that the United States has a direct impact on the well-being of the people of the United Kingdom, whether they understand it or not, whether they like it or not.
I think this
and
is
so
where...
he's in this really incredibly difficult position where he has no leverage here. He can't change anything. Should he, and I'm going to use very extreme language just to make the point, should he burn his country down for a moral principle? Or should he say, I'm going to use words that not many people will like?
And this is where I think we come back to this idea of, you know, the leadership books. You know, they all have the answers, but it's incredibly difficult to put it into practice. And we all know, do the right thing. That is the default answer. Do the right thing. The problem comes with, you know, when you are in such a complex, intertwined system, firstly, the right thing is not as black and white as the leadership books might point out. So morally, you might have a position on whether international laws were broken, destroyed, blown out the water, the consequences of that, or you might double down on, you know, and to be fair, the Maduro regime, pretty brutal, very badly run country and a lot of people suffering, and a lot of nexuses into other bad systems. You know, the Iranians buy a lot of equipment from Venezuela. Russians get oil that should be sanctioned, and there's a whole lot of stuff. Really easy, so really difficult to say morally what is the right thing. But to your point, I think when the thing that you are responsible for, the organisation, in this case, you know, a European leader is responsible for the sovereignty and security of and prosperity of their nation state, is so reliant on the bad actor or the actor that has broken the rules, it's not as easy. And
I think the phrase "not easy" is even a weird understatement.
Yeah, it is. And
it's like literally, are you willing to put the United Kingdom? I mean, I'm going to say Starmer, but this is every leader who's been commenting on this. Are you willing to physically put the United Kingdom at risk because you want to make a moral statement?
Yeah, and of course not. And of course, the responsibility, the task in the team task individual
is to keep the country safe.
It's security, sovereignty.
He's now got all these other knock-on effects. People saying, "Well, I'm not going to vote for you now." Okay, let's ask a follow-up question, because I think this is different. But let's pose like this. And actually, it's important we can't just sit here and poke at other people. I'll be clear what I think. I think at the moment, if I was in Starmer's place, I too would be very cautious about my language. I think I'd probably do the same thing. I'm sure that's what I'd be advised to do. However, and here's the follow-up statement. We're into boiling the frog territory again. What now if there are US Marines in Greenland? What if there are US Marines in Norway? Or there's a point at which you have to make a decision. So I think there is.
So I think
and how do you manage that? Because we're now into boiling frog territory. Oh, Venezuela was fine, but now Greenland, who we've got nothing to do with, you think that's bad? So, but there has to be a point at which you stop.
When you were talking about the Trump administration and Trump himself using absolute power rather than vested authority, I think what's really interesting is that the US system is flexing hard power, something that they have an absolute dominance of, and that we are wholly reliant on. And we shouldn't be, but we are. It's a system we find ourselves in, wholly reliant on our national security being outsourced to the US Department of Defense and their capabilities. And for lots of strategic reasons and norms, that is where we find ourselves. But what the Americans are doing by flexing those hard power muscles is hemorrhaging soft power.
Yes, I think.
The isolationism, the bullying use of power, the breaking of international norms, the whole thing together means that they are far less powerful from a soft power perspective. One of the things that we have is, and that we need to leverage, is we need to effectively create an off-ramp that as they hemorrhage soft power, we increase and double down on our ability to have soft power influence, whilst building, and it takes time, a self-reliance and a collective cooperation with a coalition of the willing, where we're not as reliant on this.
I agree with you,
US
but
system.
I think this is history will write whether we were talking nonsense or not. I think there is a possibility we arrive at a point where European leaders, and I'm going to say European rather than British, need to demonstrate true leadership. What you've said, I don't disagree with, which is over time we have to make sure we're less reliant on the United States. And as they lose soft power, we, as it were, take its place. We should continue to build up power. However, there may well come a point at which we have to say, we don't have that power. We don't have anything to fill the gap. But nevertheless, we declare this is the end. And I'll give this a real world example, which is at the moment, NATO cannot imagine a world without the United States being a part of it. It contributes the vast majority of the force, the money, the troops, the weapons, the technology. Right now, most people I've spoken to say there is no way we could have America leave NATO. I suspect there is no longer a zero chance that we may not have to say we're dissolving NATO, because we can no longer trust you. Even to the point now when a group of people come together and say, here's 20 things that we can no longer do, which we would... In other words, is there a leadership that gets to a point where you say, I'm now going to make a decision which puts us in a materially worse place?
Yeah.
But that is strategically better that we are now in this strategically worse place.
So I think it's a really difficult balance. What I would say is there is some leverage. There is some leverage that Europe has that America can't have. So we have access to strategic sites. That is leverage. We have intelligence access. That is leverage. We have business access. That is leverage. We should absolutely walk a very fine line between maintaining our values and maintaining our credibility as upholders of the things that we believe in, whilst not. Yeah, I'm reminded of that Love Actually moment where,
who knew we were going to reference Love Actually in this
Hugh
episode?
Grant comes out and, says, we're supposed to be special friends, but special friends, don't bully each other. You're a bad man. And that's just so unrealistic. So,
but I know.
But I am expecting, what I want to see is the European leaders stand up now and say, we recognise that you are doing your thing.
You're on a different course.
That you're on a different course and that you are irritated, annoyed by the fact that we have become too dependent on you. So we are going to pursue our own independence, militarily, financially, technologically. You are more than welcome to be part of that, but we are no longer going to be dependent on you.
We might be saying the same thing. The thing that in this genuine geopolitical case, but in terms of leadership and management of businesses, which is the thing that makes me worried, is we are at the mercy of what the United States wants to do. In other words, a better way of saying it, because that sounds very dramatic, we are reactive.
No, I think we are. I think that's a very clear way of saying it.
If the United States says, you know what, we think Europe's okay, we all breathe a sigh of relief. And if the United States says we think Europe is terrible, we're like, what are we going to do? The thing that I think is important for a leader is at some point to say, we wish to no longer be reactive.
Yeah.
The way for us to take control. So this is dramatic. It would never happen, which is at some point Europe comes together and says, we choose not to be a part of an organization where every moment you get to decide what we do in this organization. We recognize this is incredibly risky, in fact, dangerous, but we're going to leave NATO and we're going to start a different organization with a smaller group of like-minded people. And for a period of time, it will be significantly more dangerous for us. But at least we will be sovereign.
So I don't think you need to do that. And I think rather than saying we will leave NATO, because that's a really definitive thing, I think what we would need to say is we are going to build so much of our own capability that we are not reliant on the US.
I understand. And by the way,
and if the Americans decide that they don't like that, that is their
that's
choice.
Fine. But it's because
what we can't have is what currently, and one of the reasons that we have become dependent on the US is partly because we've underinvested, but partly because the US has wanted us to do that.
Yes,
so we need to push back on that and say.
But what I want to push back.
We're going to build our own capability, which means NATO could operate without the US.
I want to push back slightly on that.
But you're more than welcome to be part of the club, and you're more than welcome to come and help. But we have our own national security and our own European security to worry about. And as you're focusing on, the new Trump corollary of the Donroe doctrine, as they're calling it, of the Monroe Doctrine. Cool. As you do that, and as you pivot, and whatever you want to call it, we are going to start buying less US kit. We're going to start investing in our own sovereignty and our own capability, and we're going to work together as Europe.
So I agree with all of that. There's something in the way you're talking about this that you really, really, really want to hold on to NATO. And by the way, I'm playing devil's advocate here, Running.
So I want to hold on to NATO.
Why?
But I think we should all prepare for it.
Why would you not do it the other way around? Why would you not say, we realize that you're doing something different. Yeah. You have a different set of goals and our values no longer align. So, thank you very much. NATO has been tremendous. Lack of European wars. Thank you very much. We're going to close it down and we'll start something else. if you would like to then participate in the thing we're doing, we will welcome with open arms. I might be being even a little bit pickier. Why is it that you want to say, but we're going to leave that other thing? Because that, to me at least, feels very much like...
Because the moment you definitively say NATO is not a thing, that is when Russia moves.
Interesting. I mean,
the one thing we've not talked about in all of this, we've talked about the relationship and the balance of power between the US and Europe.
But
ultimately,
this has gone into a very different kind of an episode. But do you think that would make a difference? Because
I do.
Notionally, even if we continue as we are today, why would Russia not make a move? One imagines they have been given enough evidence that the United States would not side with NATO.
That's interesting. I think at the moment there is a growing uncertainty which makes the position of NATO weaker and weaker and weaker.
Yes, I agree.
But it's not definitive. If it was definitive, that would be enough. So I think we are having to play a very delicate balance.
Do you? I mean,
America, it's not in there, and they recognise it's not in their interest for NATO to be dissolved. Otherwise, they would have done it.
Well, I wonder whether that's political as well, which is, I think personal opinion, I suspect Donald Trump couldn't give a fig about NATO.
But I think the US.
But I think the US government, and therefore it's more of a threat to Donald Trump. But we'll never know the answer. Luckily, I'm not the Prime Minister, and if ever I do become the Prime Minister, play this back to me. This is really, really difficult stuff. Personal opinion, I really worry that strong leadership is not starting on the premise of we rely on other people. There's a point at which you say,
I agree with that.
You almost take the initiative and say, I think we're in a stronger position longer term when we take and own the initiative. And by the way, it's a risky move, but at the moment, this are we in, are we out, are we in, are we out? I think that's actually a lot more.
I think we're probably agreed.
I think we're boiling the frog, frankly, with NATO at the moment.
So I think we are agreed in that this is reliance on a third party for your organisation, and we can put this into a business context, is a dangerous position to be in, or it's a risky position to be in, especially as that third party becomes less and less dependable. So I think we are agreed that the leadership position is to then say we need to wean ourselves off.
Yes, and then maybe this is just the tactics for how you do that.
It's then about the messaging.
See what I did? I used the right use of tactics.
It's about then the relationship, and I don't think you need to burn your bridge and say you have been our supplier for 30 years, but we've decided to build these components in-house because we don't trust you anymore. I think actually all you do is you just buy less and less off them.
So, ladies and gentlemen, as we come to the end of this episode, we've just completed our first hustings for who will be Prime Minister of the UK. Gareth has decided he wants a soft exit from NATO, and I want a hard exit from NATO.
I don't want to exit from NATO
at all. No,
I want NATO to shift its centre of gravity to Europe.
Yes, and to be, all joking aside, I think that is very important that we have new goals, new values, which perhaps are not shared with many of our colleagues as they were a few years ago. I think we live in a fascinating time. In 3 years' time, will Donald Trump or a Donald Trump-like person continue to be a leader in America? Or will there be a different kind of perhaps democratic leader? And if that's the case, we've got two very, very interesting outcomes. One is a continuation of an isolationist policy and a Monroe Doctrine policy, which leads to unprecedented times in the world, continues that. If the other side comes in, if you have a democratic leadership who, let's suggest, probably would want to reverse many of those things, I can only imagine the conversation with the European government saying, we were joking. All those things we did, it was the other guy, and Europe saying,
so that's a really important point there, which is about, we've talked about the trust relationship and about building consensus, building norms, and it's trust is one of those things that's really, really difficult to build, really easy to lose. And that doesn't matter whether you are, a small team leader in a small business and you lie to somebody because you want to knock off early, or whether you're a country and you've broken the norms of an 80-year pact.
Yeah.
Like, it's easy to break, it's easy to state things and change things. It's really difficult to revert them back and rebuild those relationships. So we might find ourselves in 3 years' time with a completely different US government, with a completely different US strategy. I think
we'll never forget
some of the norms that have been broken will be remembered by both us, the US, and other actors in the world, and the geopolitical consequences of that are profound. And I think that is analogous to all business and all leadership and organisational context, where the consequences of actions are as important as the strategic goals and the short-term tactical gains. And that's what you've got to balance. And that is what I think is not currently being balanced by the US administration.
What a perfect way to finish up today. And to anyone listening to this, I don't know whether you agree or disagree with us or think we're being idiots, because it's much simpler than that. I caught up with an old friend today when I was in London, and we had a conversation about what values we held dearest, because we're those kinds of nerds when we meet each other. And he offered that people who care about stuff, and I completely agree with that. My second one was that I added in there was being curious. For anyone who thinks this is all pretty simple stuff and they know how they would deal with it, please be curious. Why is it that the world struggles through this? Why is it that Starmer is having to be very, very careful what he says? Why is it that the military are behaving in the way they do? This is all very, very complicated. And the worst possible outcome is the phrase, "You're all stupid. This is the answer." Well, on that happy note, and I'm hoping we don't have another semi-emergency podcast in the next few weeks after the invasion of Greenland, thank you very much for joining us. I hope that was interesting. I think we managed to broadly stay clear of politics-ish. Well, maybe towards the end we slipped into it.
I think we absolutely talked about politics. I think what we've tried to do really hard is to learn lessons without getting on our soapboxes about right and wrong.
Yes, I think that's well said. If you have enjoyed this, or at least if you've survived through all of this and are still listening, then please do like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. If you feel very strongly either way about anything we've said, genuinely, we love reading your emails and listening to your comments, and we should definitely do an episode where we do readers' questions or listeners' questions.
Yeah.
Please email us at battlingwithbusiness@gmail.com. We'd love to know what you think. Did we miss the mark, or did we sort of scratch some itches around leadership? We are also available on Battling with Biz with a Z on both Twitter and Blue Sky. I think that just about wraps it up. Maybe next week we'll go back to normal. I think we have an influencers next week.
We do?
That's a good one. I really, really enjoyed that one. So join us then. Otherwise, for the moment, thank you very much for joining us on Battling with Business.
Thanks very much. Cheerio.